Good evening. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are so pleased to welcome the legendary investigative journalist Bob Woodward to campus this evening for a conversation with David Axelrod. We are hosting this program to honor the legacy of David and Ann Broder, both alums of the U Chicago. David Broder, a former colleague of Mr. Woodward's at the Post, was himself a titan in political journalism. He was nicknamed Dean of the Press Corps, and our mission through this annual program is to keep the memory and extraordinary example of David Broder alive. The generosity of the Broder family also allows us to arrange and underwrite numerous summer internships for U Chicago students, as well as an annual Broder Fellow in Journalism, a position currently held by David Yepsen of Iowa Public Television, who has been in residence with us this past quarter. The IOP is proud to know the Broder family as both supporters and friends. I want to mention a few upcoming events. Thursday, we will welcome Patrick Gaspard, former U.S. Ambassador to South Africa and current president of Open Society Foundations, for a conversation on global trends toward nationalism and isolationism. Next Friday, David Axelrod will be talking with members of the IOP's Board of Advisors for our final program of the season about the 2020 presidential race as part of the university's Alumni Weekend activities. You can find out more about these and other IOP programming at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. Tonight's format's a little special. It will be a live taping of the Axe Files, so you're part of this show too. We want you to clap. We want you to laugh. We don't necessarily want you to cry, but the point is that you should be audible. That's perfectly fine, and it's encouraged. The one thing that we don't want as part of the show is your cell phone. So please pull it out right now. Take a minute to silence it or turn it off. If you want to take a quick photo at the start of the event, that's fine, but we ask that you not take any pictures or photos after that. We will open up the floor after David's conversation to take questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone that will be in the center aisle. And as usual, we give priority for the first 3 questions to our students, and we remind you that a question is brief and ends in a question mark. Here to formally introduce our guest is Dylan Wells. After Dylan comes to the stage for the student introduction, that's when the show's going to begin. David will kick us off. So when Dylan finishes her intro, please be loud and keep your applause going until they start the podcast. Dylan is a 4th year from Portland, Oregon, studying political science. At the IOP, she has served as the communications chair for the Student Advisory Board, as a coordinator for our voter engagement efforts, USHI Votes, and as editor-in-chief of The Gate, the IOP's online political journal. Please welcome Dylan to the podium.
Good evening. It is my honor to introduce the legendary Bob Woodward this evening. In the course of his expansive career, Mr. Woodward has gained a reputation as one of the nation's leading journalists and as an influential advocate for protecting the press. He is an associate editor of the Washington Post, a prolific writer and reporter, and the author of 19 books. 13 of Mr. Woodward's books have been #1 national bestsellers, including his most recent work, Fear, Trump in the White House. He has worked at the Post for nearly 50 years, and during that time has shared 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his coverage of the Watergate scandal and of 9/11. Mr. Woodward's career shows the power of journalism to expose the inner workings of the government, to uncover stories that would otherwise go untold, and to even bring down a president. Woodward began his career at the Post in 1971, and the next year was assigned to cover the burglary of the DNC headquarters at the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. His reporting, alongside Carl Bernstein, played a critical role in the eventual resignation of then-President Richard Nixon. Woodward and Bernstein's coverage of Watergate is recorded in their book, All the President's Men, which was named one of the top 100 best nonfiction books of all time by Time magazine, which called it perhaps the most influential piece of journalism in history. And Woodward has extensively covered every president since. His reporting on President Trump and his book focusing on the first years of this administration offer an intimate look into everything from North Korea to the Mueller investigation. We welcome Mr. Woodward here today for a live taping of the Axe Files, along Institute of Politics Director and former journalist himself, David Axelrod. Please join me in welcoming them both.
Thanks, Len. Bob Woodward, welcome to the Institute of Politics, welcome to the Axe Files, and welcome home. It'll take about 10 seconds for people to recognize when you speak that you were born and raised around these parts. Your accent is pretty distinct.
Slow.
Flat A's, but it's great to see you, and it's great to see you here at this Broder lecture. I know that David and Ann Broder were friends of yours, as was both graduates of the University of Chicago. Ann was a force in and of herself as a good government advocate and a community activist. And David Broder was the gold standard in political reporting. When I was a young political reporter, everyone looked to him as the person they wanted to grow up to be in journalism. Tell me about your relationship.
Broder was great, and he and I collaborated on a series for the Washington Post in 1991-92 on Dan Quayle, who was the vice president. And we got really hosed down for it because we had some nice things to report on Quayle. But Broder was, what was nice to
Were
work
you brought on as the investigative reporter because you wanted to find nice things to say about?
Yeah, and we reported that lots of Republicans on the record, like Senator Warren Rudman, said Quayle does not have the moral authority to be president. We described how his wife, Marilyn Quayle, was so full of angst about Quayle's obsession with golf that she took a picture of him playing golf and kicked it in up on the hill.
Well, this sounds like a pretty flattering depiction. I can see why you got criticized.
Yes, right. And but here, you know this from your work with President Obama, that collaboration means you do different things and look at different avenues. And working with Broder was great because I would go out and try to investigate and find. I went and played golf with Quayle. I didn't carry the bag, but I walked around for 18 holes, and you could see he loved golf more than politics.
Yeah.
And then Broder would be, as you know, Broder was the sort of person who would go to a lieutenant governor's conference in Nebraska and be up all night, and then if there were 3 county chairmen from Montana having breakfast, he would be there.
More than that, he was famous for knocking on doors, for getting in his car, driving around a state, knocking on doors, talking to people, going to
voters. He was obsessed, and quite rightly so, with we're covering politics from the inside, and we need to get outside. What do those people on those, when you knock on those doors, say? And he created a whole new blend of journalism.
Which I fear we've gotten away from. I think if he had been around in 2016, his reporting might have been a little different than some of the reporting we saw, because conventional wisdom seized control of the reporting. I remember when I was a young reporter, I was covering, there was a mini Democratic convention in Philadelphia, and the mayor turned over his box to the press corps to a Phillies game, and we went to the mayor's box. Broder was there. He was a great baseball fan, and the box had no windows, so you couldn't hear the ball hit the bat. You couldn't, and he was outraged by this, and he said, "I'm going to the press box." Now, the sports writers wouldn't let him in because he wasn't a sports writer, and he told them, "Well, you guys are not getting into the convention." But the point is, he was someone who, he was a very traditional guy. He had views about politics and government, that were not naive, but they were reverential, and he communicated that about the process.
He wanted the system to work. In fact, David, and I know this from conversations with him and his columns and reporting, was deeply offended by Vietnam and Watergate because it didn't fit into regular order of politics. He was also a genius. If I may quote from the text, this is something Broder wrote about one political figure in December 1972. This is after Nixon had won a landslide victory, 49 out of 50 states. But Broder argued, Time magazine made Nixon and Henry Kissinger the men of the year, and Broder disagreed, and he said there is a politician out there who, quote, is the spokesman and symbol of the teed-off, frustrated, fed-up Americans who sense that they've been made outsiders. Mm-hmm. Sounds like Trump,
sure
doesn't it?
Yeah, sure
well,
does.
Of course, Trump was not running in 1972, but who Broder nominated for Man of the Year was George Wallace, because Wallace represented the outsider.
Yeah.
He won the Democratic primary in Florida
Yes.
in 1972, and if he had not been shot, Broder hypothesizes that Nixon would not have won, perhaps.
And we should point out that the Man of the Year was not an award for necessarily the most admirable person, but for the most influential person. I've always argued that if you want to look at the roots of Trumpism, that George Wallace is a good place to start. And some of his speeches were...
And Broder had it.
Yeah.
And he captured that sense of angry, displaced...
In part because he did knock on people's doors, and he didn't knock on them with judgment. He knocked on them in the spirit of learning what was on their minds. And your colleague David Marinus, who worked with him on the political beat, said that one February after a presidential election, he was sitting with Broder and Dan Baltz, who's both of them still at the Post, and he was fidgety, and he turned to them and said, I just feel like going up to Manchester and knocking on doors, don't you? So that's who he was. But let's enough about David. Let's talk about you. And I mentioned
No, let's not. Let's talk about David.
You are from Wheaton. You born in Geneva, raised in Wheaton, a suburb west of Chicago, conservative area. Your dad was a lawyer. He also was a Navy war veteran. He was in the Pacific.
In World War II.
Yeah, I read that he listened to the Cubs in the World Series in 1945 on some sort of radio hookup in the Pacific. So
yes, and he was a lawyer and a judge, a trial judge and an appellate judge. And one of the great benefits of being the son of a lawyer and a judge is, I think it was about in third grade, my father said to me, look, always listen to the lawyers. They have the most important, significant, meaningful things to say unless you listen carefully. Great advice for all of us.
Yes, yes. You, one thing that seems consistent between your boyhood and this moment is you were kind of a snoopy kid. You were always kind of probing around. You were a night janitor at your father's law office and apparently spent more time reading stuff on people's desks than you did cleaning up.
Yes, but again, it was a wonderful lesson because they had in the attic the disposed files, which were in alphabetical order. And in Wheaton, Illinois, Billy Graham territory, and there was that sense, at least on the surface, that everyone is on the up and up and quite moral. And then
You found
go,
a different story in the attic. Huh?
Yes. The disposed files were my first lesson in journalism because I looked up the names of people I went to high school with, and there would be sexual assault cases that were buried or tax fraud cases that were buried. It turned out the most notorious girl in the high school was having an affair with the principal. And that they actually wired her, and it was the first opportunity I had to see the evidentiary purity of a tape recording.
Which would come to play a big role in your future endeavors. You went to Yale as a Navy ROTC. Did you do that because of your father's service, or?
It was 1961, and it seems unbelievable, but the draft was thought to be inevitable at that time, and so instead of going into the Army, I would go into the Navy as an officer like my father had been. John F. Kennedy was just elected president. He'd been a Navy person, so this was kind of the safe route. Of course, when I got out of college, we were in the middle of that quagmire called the Vietnam War.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting period. I mean, because there was all this hopefulness and vigor, as he would say, when Kennedy got elected. And by the time you graduated from college, we were making the turn into Vietnam, and attitudes were very much divided and changed, and all of that hope from the beginning of that era was fading into extraordinary conflict.
Yes, and then when I graduated in 1965, I had to go into the Navy, and they sent me to a ship, incidentally, which was a presidential relocation site in case of nuclear war. And as a young ensign, I was given responsibility with another officer for the nuclear authentication codes. Wow. And I remember those codes and how they worked, and it was the first...
Don't share them here.
I did not bring any home. And but it was very sobering to see that there was this authentication system, emergency action messages, and one person could actually send out and make it sound like the president, the National Command Authority, had ordered use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And so for always, as a reporter, I was very interested in this issue, and I quite frankly even think today we have not really solved that question of how might we use nuclear weapons defensively or offensively.
Yeah, we can get back to this later when we talk about the current possessor of the nuclear codes.
And who might that be?
It's good. Well, again, we'll come to that later. But you also were assigned to the Pentagon as part of that service. You had a chance encounter when you were at the Pentagon. They sent you over to the White House to deliver some papers, and
the Nixon White House.
And you had to wait.
Right.
And while you were waiting, there was someone else sitting next to you who was waiting too. And who was that?
Well, we were like two passengers on a transatlantic flight, and because at the Kissinger NSC, they always made you wait, and I was just delivering papers in a sealed envelope, but it turned out it was Mark Felt, the became number two in the FBI, who was deep throat and assisted us in the Watergate reporting.
You chatted him up?
Yes, sure.
Was he eager to be chatted up?
No.
Or did he tolerate you?
Not at all. No. But it was a long time, and I was thinking of going to law school when I got out of the Navy, and he acted kind of initially as a career counselor because he'd gone to law school and taken some graduate courses as I was taking at that point. And then when I wound up working for the Washington Post, I called him. And
You asked for his number that day.
yes, of course. I think when we
You weren't
met,
even a reporter yet. You were showing reporter's instincts.
well, yes, but I've always asked for phone numbers. I think when you and I first met, I got your phone number also.
Yeah, and regrettably, I gave it to you.
No. You and I had exactly, as I recall, the proper
We did.
relationship between somebody in government and somebody in journalism.
We did. So we'll get to his utility to you later, because you really didn't know what you wanted to do. You got admitted to Harvard Law School. Not a bad law school. It's not the University of Chicago Law School, but a good law school. And you decided not. You decided instead you were going to try to be a reporter, which must not have sat well with your father, who was probably sitting on the bench at the time.
Yes, that time. What happened, I was 27 when I got out of the Navy, and I did and I was going to go to law school, and I thought, let's see, so I'll be 30 when I get out, and as you know, at that age, that's the end of life. And I thought, maybe I can find something else to do, and walk to the Washington Post. And I was looking for anything to do. I sent it away for an application at the CIA. I never filled it out.
Did you ever think of staying in the military?
No, absolutely not, because I saw the Vietnam bombing reports that were top secret, and it would show that they'd send out 500 sorties and 4 would hit targets, and then Nixon and the admirals and generals and Secretary of Defense was saying that the bombing is highly successful. And
So you saw them in your role at the Pentagon?
Yeah, I saw the lie, and they accumulated, and so I got a tryout at the Washington Post, and I failed.
Yeah. Well, you weren't a reporter, right? That's what, you didn't
Right.
have those reportorial skills.
But the local editor said, so you don't know how to do this? And I said, thank you. And he said, why are you thanking me? You failed. And I said, because I know this is what I want to do. You know this. There's something about the newsroom.
Yeah.
The immediacy, the sense of quest, of what's really going on, what's hidden,
It's
what
the
does it
greatest,
mean
yeah.
to people. It's the best job in America. And I got a job at a weekly newspaper, and for a year had some stories that they wished they'd had, and so they hired me, and I was working night police, and the Watergate burglary occurred, and it was a beautiful
Just 8 months
set.
after you got to the paper or something.
Yeah, pardon?
Just 8 months after you got to the
Right,
Post.
exactly. And it was a beautiful Saturday morning, and the editor sat around and said, who would be dumb enough to come to work this morning? And I was at the top of the list. And so they sent me to the courthouse to see the burglars, and it was a moment of immense revelation because the burglars had business suits, and I covered night police for 9 months and
Yeah.
never ran into a burglar who even had half a suit.
Right.
And they had $100 bills, and the lead burglar, when the judge pressed him, reluctantly said he'd worked for the CIA, and I'm sitting in the front row, and I think I burst out improperly and said, holy shit.
Improperly, but aptly.
Yeah, and then the next day was a Sunday, and 2 reporters came to work, myself and Carl Bernstein, and we then teamed up and worked for 2 years, 2 months.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that relationship. Carl, who I know we worked together at CNN, but obviously you're both well known to the world and became well known through your book, through the movie, and so on. But you guys were sort of the Felix Unger and Oscar Madison of journalism. I mean, you were quite different personalities, and this was kind of a shotgun deal where you were thrown together on this story. How did that work?
I'd just been a reporter, not even a year at the Post, and I learned a great deal from Carl. And Carl was very aggressive and realized we could not go see people at the White House or in their offices at the re-election committee. So he came up with the idea of knocking on doors at night to talk to people, and it was a really important lesson. We always didn't get a yes, but we found some of the people who controlled the money as the bookkeeper and the treasurer, and that was very important. And later on, just 10 years ago, I realized how lazy I'd become and was not knocking on doors at night. And there's a mystique to it. And I went to see a general who wouldn't talk to me for one of the George W. Bush books. And the best time to go is kind of 8:17 on a Tuesday night. Because it's not Monday, it's not the end of the week. The general will have eaten dinner if he's there, and so I knocked on his door. May I quote him directly? Yeah. Yes, okay. He opened the door and looked at me and said, "Are you still doing this shit?" And I'd learned from the CIA people, you need to let the silence suck out the truth and be quiet. Shut up. Just listen. I have a little technique of doing this, jamming this finger into my little fingernail so it hurts, and it's a memory aid to keep quiet and listen. I don't listen enough. And then he invited me in, and we were able to develop a relationship of trust from a no to a real yes.
So talk about Mark Felt. When you called him initially, what was his reaction?
Well, I first called him about the assassination attempt of Governor Wallace in May of 1972, or April or May.
In Maryland, yeah.
In Maryland, when Arthur Bremer tried to kill Wallace. And Mark Felt was willing to help me because there was a big conspiracy theory that Bremer had not acted alone, and he gave me lots of information about how Bremer had stalked lots of candidates, including President Nixon, and so it led to a series of front-page stories on that. And then when Watergate came, one of the first calls I made was about Howard Hunt, whose name was in the address books of some of the burglars. And
worked at the White House.
Yeah, he worked, and it said H Hunt-W House, and I remember looking at that, and Carl Bernstein said, W House could only be one of two things. So he called the whorehouse, and I called the White House. But Felt was able to say this wasn't just having somebody's name in an address book, that this was somebody involved. And you now go back and look at the tapes of Nixon's conversation with his chief of staff, Haldeman, about that story. They were really, who's leaking? How's it get, you've been in that business, right?
Yeah, but it's not the normal set of affairs that you get to hear the people you're writing about talk about the stories you're writing about in private like that.
Exactly. So. I love the Nixon tapes. I have them on cassettes, and I play them in my car, and I've upgraded to CDs, actually. They are an astonishing record of anger and criminality and abuse of power.
Do you think that, well, first of all, let me ask you this. As this thing started to unravel, what was your level of surprise at each juncture? I mean, and ultimately when it led to the very top.
Yeah, it was, there was not a lot of surprise, because early on we reported that John Mitchell, who was Nixon's campaign manager, his attorney general, had approved the funding of Watergate and other spying operations, and that was a couple of months before the election. No one believed it, really. It seemed inconceivable, and conventional wisdom was, oh, Nixon's too smart to be involved in this. So, again, one of the lessons is the importance of incremental coverage. You just do a little piece at a time, a little piece here, a little piece there, and Carl and I wound up writing 200 stories about Watergate, and some of them were bigger than others, and some of them were just a little story that was kind of a footnote.
Yeah, Nixon not only said those things on tape, but he was not very flattering about you guys. When he did his interview with David Frost, he had a few choice words for...
He did, and it was an interesting evening watching that, because Nixon said that he wouldn't name Carl and myself, but he said those two correspondents for the Washington Post, what they write is trash, and they are trash. And went on to say that, you know, they work for the Washington Post, it's a liberal newspaper, and so forth. And so I did.
Thank God that's all in the past, huh?
Yes, right. You're dying to get to Trump, aren't you?
I think he would insist.
Okay.
We will get to him.
Okay.
But go ahead.
No, because what, so at this point, when Nixon said these things about me, I called my mother, you know, which is a good thing to do. And I said, you know, what do you think? Did you see Nixon? And she said, oh, yeah. I said, well, you know, what do you think about where he called us trash and we write as trash? She said, oh, no, that's just politics. Pause. What's this about being a liberal? Which, as you know, I try to be as nonpartisan as I can, and
yes.
I'm not. And
yeah.
So.
Well, there aren't a lot of liberals, or at least there weren't then, maybe more now, who knows, in Wheaton in the 1970s. So you would have stood out at the time there. Let me ask you about, you talk about what Nixon said, and the words are kind of familiar. And I've asked this question of a number of people, because I think about it all the time. If Nixon had had Fox News, if he had had social media, if he had had the tools that are available now, would he have left? Because he left because Republicans walked up to the White House and said they could not support him any longer. Now, it was after tapes were revealed with his voice on it, and that's a significant difference.
Yes, but even if the tapes existed and were out, I don't think Fox News, I don't think anything would have protected Nixon. And if I may, because I think this is, in a sense, one of the most important things going on right now, and that is the silence of the Republicans about Trump. And you have a great poker face when I say that, and it's not a partisan judgment.
No, I
it's
don't
a factual judgment. Yeah. I know lots of Republicans, and Republicans have the same level of anxiety and distress as lots of Democrats do, but they will not come public with it for political reasons, survival reasons, which
Yeah.
are understanding.
Right.
But what is really important is how the silence of the Republicans was broken about Nixon. And after Nixon resigned, one of the doors we knocked on was the apartment of Barry Goldwater. Now,
Yes.
he invited us. He was the conscience of the conservative movement. And
he was the one who delivered the message to Nixon.
Yeah, but he read from his personal diary about how he went to Nixon with the Republican leaders in the House and the Senate. And it's a stunning moment because it was August 7th, 1974. The smoking gun tape was out, and Nixon was losing support in a big way. But so they're meeting, just Nixon with Goldwater and the two Republican leaders. And Nixon knew he was going to be impeached, charged. And he said to Goldwater, said, Barry, so how many votes do I have in the Senate? 20? Now, 20 is not enough because you need 34 to stay in office if there's a Senate trial. And Goldwater said, Mr. President, I've counted the Republicans, and you have 4 votes, and one of them is not mine. The next night, Nixon announced he was resigning.
Yeah.
And the day after that, Nixon officially resigned, and in a farewell address in the East Room of the White House, an amazing goodbye, because he had no text. He was sweating. He talked about his mother and his father, and at one point he waved his hand and kind of like, this is why I called you here. And he said, quote, always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself. Here, Nixon, at this moment of giving the presidency up that he had fought all of his life for, realized the toxic nature of hate. And that, I mean, it's not just a political lesson, it's a human lesson for kids, adults, everyone. Hate doesn't destroy the people you hate, it destroys you. And that hate, and if I may jump to Trump for a moment. And
You just want to talk about Trump, don't you?
Okay, good, okay. You're drooling. I
am not drooling.
Over.
I had other stuff here.
Okay,
I got plenty of stuff here.
No, I know. But this is important. We now have in the White House President Trump, and again, this is as empirical as I can be, but what we see. Trump will go to these rallies and he'll say, punch him in the face. If you do that, I'll pay your legal fees. On and on about violence and how, he said at one rally, he said, no one wants to hurt anyone anymore. He's lamenting. And if you look at it, what Trump has done, and you can draw a straight line from Nixon to Trump, Trump has legitimized hate. And he has said it is acceptable in American politics. Having done books on 9 presidents and tried to understand them and previous presidents from reading, having hate in our political culture as something legitimate should be intolerable in America. And it's not. It is out there. And I lament as a citizen that it has come to this point. And this isn't about policy or politics. This is about the language that this is happening before our eyes, where the president goes out and says things that if your teenage child said those things, it would be unacceptable in the extreme. So bottom line, we are at a point of, it is a pivot point in history about how we are going to deal with the legitimization of hate in American politics.
Let me ask you about journalism in this era, because in those rallies where you talk about him saying, I'm going to punch, you can punch someone in the face, I'll take care of your legal fees, a staple of those rallies is the lambasting of the news media. What is the impact of that, if any? I know everybody's out there doing their jobs. It's actually an invigorating time to do reporting right now. But what are the dangers of that, if any?
Well, it's indeed not a good thing for democracy. But I think, in a sense, the press may be overreacting to this. Nixon did this in 1972. He called Carl and myself, or had his spokesman say, we're character assassins, that we're making things up, all the things Trump says. And I think Trump attacks the news media because we're doing our jobs, and he doesn't like what we're finding out. And I think that we need to kind of be aggressive but sober about it all and not wring our hands. I think there's too much on cable news about where there is just ridicule of Trump or adoration of Trump. That's not good political dialogue. And the problem is so much was put on the Mueller report and investigation, and by and large, I think that may be over, and reporters are somewhat demoralized who don't like Trump or think there's more to find out, and what we need to do is commit ourselves to finding new sources and working harder. There are endless paths. I fault myself in the 2016 election for not being more aggressive to get his income taxes. His income taxes are a road to who he is. Take in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, he'd been in the Senate, 4 years? Suppose we couldn't find out his voting record. That'd be absurd, right? Trump's taxes are a roadmap to who he is, and we didn't get them, and we should have, and I fault myself mightily for not.
Do you think you could have gotten them without his cooperation? Do you think through sources you could have gotten his tax returns?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any doubt that they're going to be disclosed now?
No, I have a lot of doubt. People kind of think Trump's effort to say no to the House on all kinds of document and witness requests and so forth. One thing Trump understands is the power of no. You just say no. And I'm not sure it's a winner for the House Democrats in the highest court in the land. And I've done a book on the Supreme Court, followed it very closely, and I think it's very much up in the air whether the Supreme Court would say, even in an impeachment investigation, the president has to provide evidence or testimony. Bill Clinton didn't testify in the Lewinsky-Whitewater investigation. So there's a lot that's hazy out there, I think.
Well, Clinton did provide a taped deposition, and that became quite a problem for him.
Well, but he actually told the truth when he acknowledged that there was an inappropriate relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And the House impeached him, saying he lied in that testimony. Actually, that's when he, perhaps the only time he told the truth.
You said you were, that the Mueller report was a disappointment to some, and you think that it's over. Tell me why you feel that way, because he left a lot of loose ends there, including this question of obstruction. But you seem unimpressed with the final product.
Well, I've read the Mueller report twice, and on the Russian coordination collusion, they say there's no evidence. And on the obstruction, they say there are 10 examples, maybe 5 are strong. But if there's no evidence that there was a preceding crime, what's Trump obstructing? He's obstructing an investigation which he believes, as he said, is a witch hunt. And Mueller would never say it was a witch hunt, but he did say he didn't find any coordination, which was the core of the case.
Although you know that you don't need an underlying crime to be charged with obstruction
You
of
don't,
justice.
but if you're president, see what happened with the Nixon tapes, it raised the bar so high. You have to have a quality of evidence. I mean, in Nixon's tapes, there's one time John Dean, his counsel, tells him, we're being blackmailed by the burglars and their overseers, and they want money. And Nixon, how much would that cost? And Dean said, $1 million. And Nixon says, $1 million, I know where we can get that in cash. And in the rest of the meeting, 12 separate times, he orders the payment of blackmail money, clearly obstructing the investigation that would lead to him. There's not that kind of evidence in the Trump case, and quality of evidence, as you know, really matters.
And you're comfortable that Mueller was thorough in his investigation?
No. I found people who Mueller didn't interview. But Trump's still there, at least last I checked.
Yes.
And what we have is a governing crisis. I focus in the book not on Mueller or scandal, but how Trump governs North Korea, China, the Middle East, tariffs, taxes, and so forth. And you see that Trump has ideas in his head time and time again. They'll say, his aides, his cabinet officers say, where did you get that? And Trump will say, oh, I've had that idea for 30 years, and if you disagree with me, you're wrong. Like tariffs. Now, if everyone here was an economist and we said, how many people think tariffs are a good thing, maybe there'd be 2 people who would raise their hands. Because tariffs make no sense in the global economy. Trump is obsessed with trade deficits. He thinks we lose that money. We do not lose that money. You know who pays for that? We do, right. Citizens. We paid the tariff tax.
But his political instincts might not be, that you're talking about his governing instincts and knowledge, but politically, in a country where you have great divisions and polarity in our economy, and people like in this region here have seen enormous economic dislocation because of globalization, because of technology. He is striking a responsive chord with some people. Trade was actually one of the reasons he got elected.
Yes, but if you look at the facts about it, as I report in the book, they had a plan, the cabinet and the White House staff, to go after China on what's called a 301 violation, intellectual property theft.
Which is a serious problem.
And they were going to organize the world, Asia and Europe on this, and it had a lot of hope, and Trump pulled the plug, called steel executives in, imposed tariffs on aluminum and steel, including China, and just upended the whole thing. His chief of staff, his chief economic advisor, had no idea Trump was doing this. And what's happened, and this is so interesting in the journalistic analysis, that your argument that, well, China does lots of bad things and Trump is kind of stepping up and
Well, I didn't make that argument. I'm saying he's making that argument.
yes, but a lot of people have kind of bought it, and I think, quite frankly, we've been had, that there is an argument there, and there are lots of ways to go after China. And now, at the same time, and I show this in the book, there are strong things Trump did, something that I wrote a book about Obama on, and Afghan decision-making.
Right.
And when
I think we talked about that at the time.
30,000 troops, and Trump's out there saying, well, what are we trying to accomplish? It isn't working. And those debates took place in the Obama presidency in the Situation Room. And I think many people, and I think at core, Obama himself was not comfortable with the Afghanistan war. He was kind of committed because in the campaign he had promised that. But so Trump has
But he
raised
also was
some
looking
good-
for a way to create an arc that could get us out of there. Obviously, we didn't get completely out of there, but you know, I was a witness to some of those conversations.
a lot of it. But as you were to look back on that, do you feel comfortable with that decision?
Whose podcast is this anyway? I feel
The balance of power has just shifted.
I feel. Let me take it back. I feel comfortable that he made the decision that he thought was right to try and truncate our stay there, and he felt he had to take that step in order to begin pulling back. You know, history will judge whether that was the right step or not. All I know is that it was the result of a lot of painstaking conversation, study, work, because these are grave decisions, and that's how those decisions should be made. Whether you come to the right conclusion or the wrong conclusion, you ought to take them seriously.
That's a fair point, and I made that point in my book. But one of the instincts, as you know, Obama had, when I interviewed him for Obama's wars about the Afghan policy and the war decision-making, he was quite open, and at the end I read something from a historian about how war is a mess. And I asked President Obama to read this, and he read it, and he said, go read my Nobel Prize acceptance speech.
Right.
And I ran home and read it, and he said, war sometimes is necessary, but it always is a manifestation of human folly.
Right.
And I think on that, history will show, have been right. That war, unless you're attacked, presidents, and to Obama's credit, he didn't think this. I think some presidents have thought war solves problems. I think war creates problems.
Well, his view was also informed by the history of Iraq and the quagmire that it became. Where do you think we are now relative to national security, and do you think we're closer or farther away from war because we have a situation of a gearing up in Iran? We have obviously this odd situation with the North Koreans. We've got this trade war. I mean, what is your state? And more than that, based on your reporting, what is the temperature in the Pentagon right now where General Mattis is gone. He was a figure in your book.
He was the Secretary of Defense.
Yes.
First time.
Yes. And what is the level of comfort with Trump as Commander-in-Chief?
There is a meeting I reported on, which is was not in the book because it's more recent, where the generals and the admirals are meeting, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs says, you know, the only institution in America that's working is the military. And I think there's some truth to that, but the president is commander-in-chief, and as we know, presidents can essentially start wars all on their own. So it's a really important question. What is the temperature everywhere is high anxiety, and I think the mistake as journalists and citizens and political figures may collectively make here is that we think, oh, that's Trump. You know, that's what he does. Everyone will, I mean, there's this constant strain of criticism of him. He's violating norms. It's not normal. Well, I think that's kind of a baseless charge. We knew when he was elected. He is a walking example of violating norms.
So you're not
when he
saying
goes out and says some of the things he says, and everyone sits around on cable news and elsewhere, not on Fox, but on MSNBC and your network, CNN, and they say he's violating all these norms. This is not, the Trump supporters sit out there and go, yippee.
Right.
That's why he was elected. And I think we've lost some insight into exactly why he was elected in this idea of...
Why do you think he was elected?
I think the best explanation I found, and it's simple, but it captures a lot. In August 2016, several months before the election, Trump hires Bannon as his chief strategist. And Trump is down 14 to 16 points in the polls, and he's deeply worried. And Bannon says, look, all the polls collectively show that about 2/3 of Americans feel the country's on the wrong track. And 3/4 of the country feels we're in decline. That's Hillary Clinton. You are going to win. Mm-hmm. And I think the wrong track, America on decline argument people were making in one form or another to themselves, and that doesn't entirely account for his victory.
Well,
I think it's part of it. What do you think is, I mean, you're the guru on this.
Look, yeah, well, I was deficient, I think, in my analysis because I saw it through the prism of traditional thinking, and I think a lot of people made that mistake. Well, in the exit polls, 40%, the largest number of people, given a list of reasons for their vote, said they voted for change. He got 85% of that vote. He was change, and she was the status quo. There were other reasons as well. I do think that there are great divisions in our country and in the world, and you see it in Europe as well, that go to who's on the right side of this new economy, who feels like they're not. It also is cultural, and it's racial, and it's ethnic, and a sense among Trump's voters, I think, of loss.
Okay. Now, I got in a hair shirt personally and for the media. I think we didn't do enough. Do you think Obama is in part responsible for the Trump victory?
I think that the reason I thought Obama could get elected was because he was the antithesis in many ways of George W. Bush. And my theory about particularly succession elections is the departing president defines the election, and people never choose the replica, they choose the remedy. And Trump was the antithesis of Obama in every way. And I actually wrote about that. I just should have I should have read my own writing about that. And I think that has a lot to do with it.
Isn't
Barack
that
Obama
true?
left with 50.
I've
George
written
W. Bush
things.
was at 28% when he left office. That made Obama's job easier. Obama was at 57%. But it's also true that it's very hard for a party to win 3 terms. And there were a lot of things that worked for Trump. But I don't minimize the the political achievement that he pulled off in winning.
May I just ask this question? During the Obama presidency, I had breakfast with David Cameron when he was a British Prime Minister.
Yes.
And I asked
author
him,
of the Brexit referendum.
Yes, but I asked
That's
Cameron,
what do you
and he knew Obama well, and they're leaders in this alliance. And I said, what do you think of President Obama? And he said, oh, I like him. He's so smart. Pause. But no one's afraid of him. And my heart sunk, because I think there is a certain truth to that not that, people were afraid of him, but not enough. Is that fair?
I don't know if that's true. My recollection of those 8 years, it is. There's no doubt that he was not Donald Trump. No one wrote a book about him called Fear. But on the other hand, he also comes under criticism for, as you say, the buildup in Afghanistan, for going after terrorists, for going after Osama bin Laden in the way
going
that
after reporters.
Well, yes, but not in the way this, for national security leaks and sources. There's no doubt that he did that as well. So, I don't know whether the absence of fear was the problem. I think there's some value to respect. Yeah. I think there's value to dignity. I think there's, if all you needed to be successful was fear, then the subject of your book would be doing very well, and he may well win re-election. He may win re-election. I think those who rate that as a low probability are wrong about that.
I think in November of last year there was the perfect poll, and there's never a perfect poll, but this one was, and it was called the midterm elections. And as you know, 10% of the seats shifted from Republican to Democrat.
Yeah.
It's a giant deal. And I think everything else being the same, that is a forecast.
Well, we lost 63 in 2010, and the president won pretty big victory in 2012. So it is an indication of something. Whether it's dispositive, I think we'll have to wait and see. I need to finish, but I have to ask you about the state of journalism today. You and I had a little bit of a discussion. You met with some students earlier. Yeah. When you started in journalism, when I started in journalism, we had these things called news cycles. We had editions, and there was time to actually contemplate your story, report your story. Reporters today, your colleagues at the Post, have to file often, 4 or 5 versions of a story a day. The pace is different. The competitive environment is different. How is that affecting the quality of journalism?
I think a lot. And impatience and speed, people give me the headline, give me the synthesis. And I think that's too bad. You can't. One of the great editors at the Washington Post told me you can't explain a man or a woman in an afternoon, and I think that's true. And you can't do it in a tweet or a story written under intense pressure. So we've got to somehow, in the news media, give out Valium gargles to everyone and get everyone to kind of slow it down a little bit and it's a painful road, introspection, and we've got to look at the quality of our product, and I think A lot of wonderful reporting has been done by my newspaper, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, on Trump. But we don't, you've stacked this audience here, but if we asked people how many basically distrust the news media and you were out talking to not a university crowd,
Yes.
it would be 20, 30, 40, maybe even more %. And now it may be fashionable to say that, but I think a lot of people just don't trust us. When you have a product that's not trusted, we've got to figure the road back.
And is there any responsibility on the part of the news media for that? Because we are in this
Yes.
competitive environment, and so we do tend to hype stories beyond their importance in order to get eyeballs on news sites, on cable television stations, and so on. I mean, is there some, and we do, covering Trump has been a tricky pass because, you have to cover the President of the United States, and then people say, well, why do you have to cover every tweet? Why do you have to cover, I mean, these are difficult questions, and it seems to me that the news media hasn't always gotten it right.
No, we certainly have not, but here's the variable, and that is, like you, I know lots of reporters, and I think you might agree with me on this. By and large, the news media does its business in good faith.
Yes, I do agree with that.
Yeah, and that it's not somebody sitting around, how can we spin this? How can we hype it? How can we take what
For sure.
Ben Bradley called the extra squeeze? And good faith can go a long ways, I think. And I think we'll find the corrective remedy, but this all occurs in the environment which you know so well. Presidents have extraordinary power. I don't think the public realizes how much power a president has. And Trump seizes it with his tweets and all of his statements and so forth. I frankly, and this is a reported conclusion, think that all the tweeting and the anger and the commentary and so forth from the president is a disguise. And the disguise is he really loves the show. As long as you can have the show, nothing else matters.
Yes.
And I think he does not care enough about governing. And the job of the president is, I know
we're running over, but go ahead.
it's imagine you and I
Going
running
over, yes.
Yeah. That what's the job of the president? And I've spent almost 50 years trying to ask that question, and I think it's the job of the president is to figure out the next stage of good for a majority of people in the country, not a party, not interest groups, not a base, but we could put it up on a board and then develop a strategy to get there. And it's hard in the crisis atmosphere of the presidency. But as best I can tell from my reporting about President Trump, that never comes up. And I know from interviewing Obama and talking to, as you point out, maybe some decisions right, but he was always asking that question, what's the next stage of good for the people of this country?
Yes. Well, I would say I've believed that about Democratic and Republican presidents generally, and these norms and institutions that you're right, Trump was elected to tear asunder. Those things are the things that have to be consistent. Whether views will change, policies will change, but the people in that office need to understand they're the trustees of these democratic institutions. And if we knock them down, we do so at our own peril. But we could have this conversation for a long time, and we probably will. Bob Woodward, thank you so much for
Thank you.
being here. We have time. I'm told we have time for 3 or 4 questions, and whether there's 3 or 4 depends on how long your questions are. So go ahead.
Hi, my name's Yang, 3rd year in sociology. So it is unfortunate that people can come to a common conclusion, both for sensible reasons and for vile reasons, but with very different consequences. For example, the issue of immigration is important for many sensible reasons, but it has gotten hijacked by Trump using media platform and scapegoating immigrants.
Question.
Will come soon. So my question is, how could news media combat the ill-intentioned, ill-advised, and perhaps ill-fated act of issue framing and attribution from media itself and other branches of power?
The way the media can deal with this, I think, the power of the editor, Ben Bradley, who was the great editor of the Post for so many years. I've often thought on this, and it's not what he put in the paper as much as what he kept out of the paper. He was the one who would slap the copy when we used to write on paper and say, you don't have it yet. And that was not, he didn't mean you can't get it, but you don't have it yet. Mm-hmm. Keep doing more reporting. So the answer is more reporting.
You've got a great editor now in Marty Barron, who was just here last week.
Yeah,
so.
He was. How'd he do?
Excellent. He spoke very highly of you.
He asked me to speak highly of him, too.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I'm a graduate student in political science. So at the beginning, you talked a little bit about covering a story incrementally, like bit by bit. And I wanted to ask, how do you think that approach, how does that affect the public reception of a story, doing it bit by bit versus breaking a big story all at once? And what's better about that bit by bit approach than, unloading a massive information on the public?
If you always are going for the big story, then you fall into this trap of overstating and hyping, taking 3 or 4 extra squeezes, and we somehow have to slow the process down. And now I think one of the things that may slow the process down is a crisis. Trump has not had a real crisis. And how he does that, how it deals with it, because crises occur, right?
Yes.
And in the White House, as you well know, it seems like every day.
Yeah, he's been remarkably lucky in that regard.
Yeah.
Because some of them are completely beyond your control. An oil rig blows up in the Gulf. You can't, pirates off of Somalia, you can't plan on all these things.
Remember talking to somebody in the CIA and asking about the state of the world, and this very informed person said, well, the fuse of instability is lit in about 20 countries around the world, could go off at any moment. I asked somebody else in the office of the Director of National Intelligence, which supervises all the agencies, and I said 20, and he said, that's a low number. I mean, there are...
How do they feel, by the way, about the way they're characterized by the president and him siding with Kim Jong-un, Putin, on matters of intelligence?
They don't like it, but I think, like the news media, you just have to go about doing your job. And I think most of them are, and are not wringing their hands about that war. Trump is, this again is one of the mistakes he's making, and that is he does not even know what his own self-interest is. Those people, you know this,
yes,
on the intelligence agencies are on the president's side. In the CIA, they called the president the first customer, that they serve the president. All the intelligence is really designed not for the Pentagon or the Treasury Department or the White House staff or the National Security Council. It's aimed at the president so the president can make the best decisions. And that is
They may need to visit customer relations. I don't think it's
yes.
I don't think it's going very well. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Louis. I'm a first-year public policy student. I'm wondering if you can speak about consolidation in the American news media, and especially if that feeds into some of the distrust that you mentioned in terms of the American public, particularly in terms of corporate control.
I'm sorry. What?
Corporate consolidation within the news media, corporate control.
I mean, that's something to be worried about, that one organization's going to buy lots of outlets. I think this is what you learn even as a first-year student, and I'm sure you've learned this. I've tried to learn this, is that the barriers to doing your job and figuring it out are really within yourself. You can sit and say, oh yeah, it's the consolidation of the news media, or it's...
I agree with this, but there is a real crisis as well. What's the hollowing out of local media?
Yes,
the
of
buying
course.
up of local media outlets to limit points of view, or to promote points of view, which is in certain ways worse.
And we've got to, I was talking to the students about the great Robin Williams movie, Dead Poets Society. People here seen that movie, it's great. 25 years old, Robin Williams plays the renegade, subversive lecturer, teacher in a boys' prep school, and at one point he gets up on his desk and he says, I stand on my desk to remind myself I need to think about new ways to do things. I think that applies to the media, politics, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, you name it. We need to find new ways to think about things. And in the media, the buying up and the disappearing of local news is a tragedy. And somebody's got to figure it out and figure out a way to make money.
Yeah, right.
And Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, the Amazon CEO, and people
I
from
heard that.
organizations have said to me, well, what do we do? And I said, get Bezos to buy you.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be helpful if he could buy up a whole bunch of local papers as well.
Or maybe the University of Chicago. Is it?
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a first-year undergrad studying political science. So you said that Nixon characterized you and Carl Bernstein as trash, and today Trump denounces the media as fake news. Now, the smoking gun tape is what ultimately lost Nixon the rest of his support. Is something like that even possible today in this world of fake news? Does real evidence matter anymore to get rid of the rest of Trump's support if something akin to the smoking tape came out?
Really good question.
Yeah, you mean about the...
Her question is whether in this age of literally faked media, we just saw an example of that with Nancy Pelosi, does taped evidence have the same value that it did?
If it could be authenticated, I mean, I really want to ask this question. Is there anybody there who knows about Trump's secret taping system? Please meet in the back of the room. You don't mind me availing myself of every opportunity?
No. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kenneth Newman. I'm a local resident. Do you have any feelings about how, with the atmosphere in Washington, could you see any members of the Trump family prosecuted for either violating the Logan Act or the Emoluments Clause?
You know, to do something against a president or the president's family, you really have to have really good evidence about real issues, and the Logan Act is kind of a technical violation. So the whole question is, and what really goes on, and my biggest worry is secret government. You know that when Obama, spent a lot of time trying to, what happened here, what's secret, and when I wake up in the morning, and maybe I should end on this thought, my first thought when I wake up is, what are the bastards hiding?
Yeah. I just want to say that, and you know that there were a whole generation of journalists who became journalists because of the work that you and Carl did. You can shake your head, but that is true. Some of the lessons were not the right lessons, which is that, you know, that everything is a scandal in the making, and one has to be discerning and be prepared to find that it isn't what you thought it was. That's part of good reporting. But it is also true that you guys will go down in history for having made an extraordinary contribution and underscoring why the First Amendment is the First Amendment. For a functioning democracy, we need the probing eyes of a conscientious, free press. And if anybody needs any example as to why, go back and read the work of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. So thank you so much for being here.